The goal of this video is to help us all estimate the actual new COVID-19 cases per day in your area. And it's based on analysis by Thomas Pueyo. He wrote an incredible blog post on Medium. This is the link, and I'll also include it in the description below. This is the data that he uses to do some of his analysis. Now, some of you might be thinking, hey, I know the number of COVID cases in my area. They're reporting it on the news every day. But that's the reported number of cases, and that's based on the people that happen to get the test. There are a lot of people who might not have symptoms yet, or their symptoms are not severe enough to get the test yet. So the actual cases are likely far larger than the number of confirmed cases. And we can see that in graphical form. Once again, this is a diagram put together by Thomas Pueyo. It's a screenshot from his blog post, which once again could be found here. This is all his analysis or based off of his analysis. But this shows you what was happening in Hubei province, which is the province where Wuhan is. And there's several interesting things here. The vertical axis is the number of cases, and what we see in the horizontal axis is per day. And so, for example, we could pick January 23rd. The yellow bar tells us the number of confirmed new cases that day. So these are people who would have been tested and then they tested positive. And it looks like that number is about 300. But then we have this gray bar. This gray bar is the actual number of new cases that day, which is close to 2,500. So roughly 8 times as high. Now you might be saying, how did they know the actual number of cases if they didn't test everyone? Well, the way they did that is when someone tested positive, they asked them, when did you first get the symptoms? And if they said, hey, I first got the symptoms 10 days ago, they would be included as a true new case, an actual new case, 10 days before that on January 13. So the Chinese officials were able to actually make these gray bars in hindsight based on when people said they first got the symptoms. And there's a lot of really interesting information here. First of all, we can see that Wuhan was shut down on January 23rd. So let's draw a line between the pre-shutdown and post-shutdown. And you can see just as the city officials were starting to see confirmed cases, the actual cases were far higher. But then they shut down the city, essentially significantly slowing down the spread rate. And a few days later, the actual cases, which they were able to calculate in hindsight, start to flatten out and then go down. But even though they were going down, the confirmed new cases continued to go up because there is a delay. You can even see the delay right over here. And that is roughly the amount of time between when people show symptoms and they are actually tested. Now you might be saying, hey, all right, this isn't too bad. It looks like things eventually became okay for Wuhan. But this is because they did a very serious shutdown. If they did not do this shutdown and slow the spread of the virus, you would have seen this exponential growth continue. And it's also worth remembering what I just drew this curve on. This isn't the total number of cases. This is the number of new cases per day. If you want the total number of cases at a given point in time, you would have to sum up the gray or the yellow bars, depending on whether you want to look at actual or confirmed cases. So as of January 22nd, if you total up all of these gray bars over here, as of January 22nd, you get approximately 12,000 cases, while if you add up all of the yellow bars, that is roughly only 444 confirmed cases. So before the city even went into shutdown, and this is with the Chinese doing reasonably good testing, you had a far higher number of cases than the confirmed cases would make you believe. And as large as the ratio is on a given day before the city shut down between the number of actual new cases per day and the number of confirmed new cases per day, it's probably higher in a lot of the geographies where we live because we're not testing as well as the Chinese did. For example, this is data, once again, compiled by Thomas Pueyo on his blog post. This is just a screen capture of it, and I'm really just giving his analysis. This shows the total tests performed and the tests performed per million citizens as of March 3rd. And you can see, for example, where I live, the United States is not doing so well. And so the number of reported cases in places like the United States, where we are really just starting to ramp up testing, is far understating the number of actual cases out there. So how do we go about estimating the actual number of cases in our area? Well, once again, I'm going to use Thomas's analysis. We're going to be looking at the number of deaths and estimations of mortality rate, time from infection to death, and how fast the virus actually spreads. So in other videos, I'll talk more about some of Thomas's analysis, but for mortality rate, it'll make the math simple, and this actually does seem to be a pretty good estimate. We can assume that there's a 1% mortality rate. The reports are as low as 0.6% in South Korea, and then as high as roughly 5% in places like Iran. But it looks like the higher numbers are where the hospital system is being overwhelmed, and then the lower numbers at the 0.6% might not be fully accounting for all of the mortality that will happen due to the cases that are actually out there. So we'll assume a mortality rate of 1%. The other thing we need to think about is the time from infection to death in those 1% of cases where someone does die. And to figure that out, I will look at this data right over here. This top chart, and it comes from this link, which Thomas cites, and I'll give the link in the description below. This is the incubation period. This is an estimate of the time from when someone gets infected to when they start to show symptoms. And this estimate is roughly 5 days. And then once you see symptoms, how long does it take to death in those 1% of cases, or whatever the percentage is? Well, there's varying estimates, but it looks like to make the numbers easy, we can estimate roughly 15 days. So one way to think about it is 5 days from infection to showing the symptoms, and then another 15 days from showing the symptoms to death, for a total of 20 days from infection to death in what we're assuming the 1% of cases. So I'll write 20 days. And now the other thing we're going to estimate is the days to doubling, days to double. This is how long does it take for the infection to double in the population. And this is going to be heavily dependent on what the population is doing, how dense they are, how much they're interacting. But we'll look at some of these estimates, and they're in very different contexts. And the lower the doubling rate, that means the virus is spreading very, very fast. While if you have a population that's doing all the right things, they're taking all the precaution, the doubling rate will be lower. So we could look at a conservative estimate and take a higher doubling rate than all of these estimates, and it'll make our math a little bit easier. Let's just assume a doubling rate of 5 days. And I'm using slightly different numbers than Thomas used, but it will be indicative, and you can do the same analysis with whatever estimates that you choose to do. So let's assume 5 days to double, which might be conservative, especially for places like the United States, where we have not taken anywhere near the action of a place like a China, a South Korea, or a Japan. So now let's use these numbers to figure out what might actually be happening in our areas based on the data that we are presented with. So let's say that we unfortunately hear on some day that there is 1 death in our region or in our city. Now, based on our estimates, we're saying that the average time from infection to death is about 20 days. That means that that person would have likely contracted the virus roughly 20 days ago. 20 days ago. And so I'm going to make a timeline. This is 20 days ago. This would be 10 days ago. 10 days ago. This would be 15 days ago. And then this would be 5 days ago. Now, it's possible that they were the only person who contracted the virus on that day, and then they happened to unfortunately get very sick and then pass away 20 days later. But if we assume that the mortality rate is roughly correct, it's quite possible that 100 people were infected that day. The person that we know about is that 1 in 100 who actually gets sick enough to pass away. And so if we assume that on 20 days ago, that not one person, but 100 people, so the actual number of people who were infected that day is 100 infected that day. Once again, because it's a 1% mortality rate. If we assumed a 0.5% mortality rate, then we would say, all right, there might have been 200 people infected that day, 0.5% of whom get all the way to death 20 days later. If you assume a 5% mortality rate, which would be a very unfortunate situation, but that is a mortality rate that we are seeing in different parts of the world, then you would say, well, maybe there were 20 people infected that day. When you only have 1 or 2 or 3 deaths in a region, that will make the estimates more difficult. But as unfortunately we are likely to see a larger number of deaths in various regions, that will make these backward estimates more and more reasonable. Now, if the infection rate in the population doubles every 5 days, what is now going to happen? After 5 days, you're going to have 200 cases in your region. 200 cases. Now, these wouldn't just be new cases. This would be the cumulative total number of cases due to those 100. Now, this is actually quite conservative because this is assuming that those 100 that were infected 20 days ago are the only infected cases in your region. There might be other infected cases that were infected before that date. But I'm just assuming that the 100 that were infected that day are the only cases to be conservative, and so they double after 5 days. And then they'll double again after 5 more days, and so you will get to 400 cases after 5 more days. And then you will, after 5 more days, you will have doubled, and I can't even fit it on the screen anymore. You're going to have 800 cases. And then that means today, just by evidence of that one death, you probably have on the order of, and I can't even draw the whole bar, approximately 1,600 cases. And so this is just to be a little bit sobering about how serious this is and how much the data that we actually get is actually lagging the circumstances on the ground, particularly in places like the United States, where we are barely even getting started testing. For example, in my county, which is Santa Clara County in California, we just had our second death unfortunately reported yesterday, and there was another death 5 days before that. Now, there's only under 100 reported cases in my county, but based on this analysis, the actual number of infected persons in my county is likely to be at least a factor of 10 more than that. And it could be as high as 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 people. We won't know for sure until we can do the type of hindsight analysis that the Chinese had, but this is to just remind us how serious the situation actually is. So the big takeaway here is to take all of this very, very seriously, especially because the mortality rate itself can change depending on how well equipped the hospital system can handle the situation. If we all socially isolate and take the proper precaution, the spread rate will lower and we won't overwhelm the hospital system, and we'll hopefully be able to keep the mortality rate as low as possible. But if we don't take the precaution, and if we're just complacent because we see this lagging data that's being reported to us because of the lack of testing in places like the United States, then it's very possible that we eventually overwhelm the hospital system in the next few weeks, which would cause the mortality rate to go higher.
我说了，我去看了火神山医院的人，施工现场的人特别的辛苦，工人2班倒3班倒，24小时轮番作业。那个中层、基层管理者，工人还能倒班，基层管理者基本没有休息的时间。见着我们说俩眼通红，嗓子沙哑，说我没工夫管你啊，你口罩放下你就该干啥干啥，工地你想看看吧。我已经3天没回去了，每天就睡2-3个小时。
这关系到你们了。回家，我不想回家过年啊！你们做了什么？你们做了什么？你们5个只是看了8个病，还他妈140个班，还把我们除了8个班只是3班，我们不想活。你自己看，你们到底想干什么？你们啊！我不要人，你把那些人都搞走，躺在地上那个拿走。我没有闹，这病藏那么多怎么办？
我们生人别说我们逃命，我们这里也上就是等死了，我们就是等死了。我们每回这样累都要累死了，天天上班一天休息都没有。我受不了。
我今天已经上了1天的班，已经下班了，4点多钟下班，已经在那里崩溃了半天了。真的那种感染，这个电视那里报道的可怕多了，蛮多。他们医生出来的估计大概有10万人， 们今天那里10几个医生，一天都看了100多个，蛮多都已经不行了，没得位置住。然后加上这里的老说政府的不是说到你们那里治吗？但是政府让我们开始治，根本谁么物资都没有。他们想上班主任都办不了，我觉得后续完全不行。我们在那里上一天班，整个人的心里都快崩溃了，都已经受不了了。他们在那求我们的时候，我们都一点办法都没得，就看着一个好生生的人，叫他慢慢的都不行。所以你们在屋里一定要做好防护，千万不要等到要相信政府，我觉得全部都得要靠自己。
上午到现在没有人。然后医生不说。
在抢救室的门口，这就是一个不知道在这儿放多久了。刚才我还以为是个人，我现在现在不看。
Yeah, at the moment, my daily work is changing continuously because right now I'm in an operating theater that we closed last week and transformed it into a COVID ICU. And this is the second block out of 3 in my hospital. So now we have a general ICU that is clean with no COVID patient. But now we canceled all the elective and non-urgent surgery, and we are using 2 other theaters for COVID patients. So we are expecting a surge in the next days, and we all hope that this surge will not reach the intensity of Lombardy. We are probably 9 to 10 days behind Lombardy, and the intensity that this epidemic reached in the area around Milan was really hit very hard the healthcare system. So many hospitals are nearly collapsing, and the forecast for the next 10 to 15 days is even worse. So this situation changed completely our lives in little more than 1 week. We are working very hard with extraordinary efforts in order to increase our ICU capacity and hospital capacity with we high dependency units working a lot in order to increase availability for patients. But we are not sure that will be enough. So my suggestion is that you get prepared as soon as you can, because once you start admitting severe ICU patients, it's probably too late for social distancing, isolation, and lockdowns.
Yeah, on that note, Marco, with the measures that have been taken in Italy, almost complete lockdown, like you say, you don't expect that to have a huge effect for you over the next 9 or 10 days?
We all hope that we'll see those effects in little more than 1 week, probably 10 days, but the next week will not be affected by the lockdown, because this is one of the characteristics of this disease, and especially of the severe cases. So this is an investment for the future, for the second half of March, and it is essential, otherwise we will collapse. But the next few days will not be affected at all by the lockdown implemented a few days ago. So what we know now from the epidemiologists is that a lockdown 24 to 48 hours earlier can have huge consequences 10 to 15 days later.
Marco, tell us a little bit about the people you're seeing coming into ICU there, and what you're seeing. Tell us what you see in front of your own eyes.
Yeah, it's true that for 9 people out of 10, they will experience a sort of mild clinical course like a seasonal flu. But for approximately 1 people out of 10, this will be much more severe, requiring oxygen therapy and antiviral specific therapy, and hospitalization. And for a large part of those patients, this severity will reach a need for endotracheal intubation and mechanical ventilation for many days. So we are treating those cases. And this means a long journey in the ICU, a long ICU stays, and many days of ventilation and mechanical ventilation, because the respiratory failure is severe, is reversible, but it takes a lot of resources and a lot of time in order to improve.
We see some of your staff in the background. How are the staff in the hospital there, the San Giovanni Bosco?
We are still opening this block, and we are just admitting now the first patients, and I'm in the clean area. We are really working very hard. We doubled our shifts, and after 10 days, we are already, almost all of us, we are sleep deprived, and that's a problem because we are gonna run a marathon, and we started with a rhythm that we are not sure we'll be able to bear for 1 or 2 months. So, but we cannot do anything else. I mean,
Marco, when you look at, you're obviously and understandably preoccupied with what's happening on the ground in the hospital, in the city, in the region that you are working in. What do you say to other countries around the world?
Yeah, to other countries, I have a lot of contacts with colleagues. I've been contacted by media outlets and colleagues all over the world in the last 4 or 5 days. And I'm trying to spread the word as fast as we can, get prepared as soon as possible, because the only way to prevent healthcare system collapse is to enforce a lockdown as soon as possible, to increase your ICU capacity and your hospitalization capacity, and to use simulation and to train in using PPEs, personal protective equipment, because it's crucial, because if a lot of healthcare staff get sick in the first few weeks, then you will not have anybody able to take care of the patients.
Yeah, on that, Marco, have you and your colleagues, the healthcare professionals, are you, I know you said you're sleep deprived, are you holding up in terms of being infected by this virus yourselves?
Yeah, I have a couple of colleagues who had tested positive last week. So we were tested and I'm negative now. I have to repeat my test on Tuesday. And I know of colleagues in the red zones in Lombardia where they were overwhelmed by patients that refused to be tested as they were asymptomatic, and they chose to continue to treat infected patients and working with suspect infected colleagues because the workforce is really scarce, and ICU patients need very specialized staff, both clinicians and doctors and both nurses. Nurses are the real heroes of this epidemic and this emergency.
Yeah. Just finally, Marco, I know you said that you're focusing on trying to expand capacity. You're standing in a room that is now being turned into a ward. Does Italy and your region have that excess capacity to draw on? And how important is it to have those things in place when you're looking at other countries early on?
Yeah. I'm not sure that all regions in Italy will be able to do the same as Lombardy. Lombardy is one of the richest and with the largest leading teaching hospitals, and they are making extraordinary efforts. And also we have the advantage of having them some 10 days ahead of us, so we will take the opportunity to learn from them. We are sharing information very quickly with colleagues. We have daily webinars and networks to share information. We are really making extraordinary efforts because this is an unprecedented situation for all of us. And I hope that other countries, but I cannot predict what will happen in countries with less efficient healthcare systems and also less abilities to create networks and to collaborate, because we cannot work in a silo. We have to work in a network. Okay? So we have a responsibility for all the patients, not only for the patients that we admit in our specific hospital.
Marco, just finally, when you started on this career journey, I mean, did you ever expect to be in this situation right now? I'm aware you probably have prepared for it very well, but now it's here.
No.
How do you feel?
It's surreal sometimes, and also I think that the lockdown and the emergency sparked a lot of feelings and solidarity, and strengthened a lot of people and characters. We discovered and we realized that we are more probably resilient than we thought just last month. I'm prepared to treat those patients because those are respiratory failures, and this is my daily job. But for sure, nobody was prepared to treat so many patients at the same time. So this is unprecedented for us.
Yeah, Marco, thank you so much for taking this time to speak to us. We wish you all the very best, and hopefully speak to you again soon.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Welcome to Zooming In Coronavirus Special. I'm Simone Gao. President Trump is ready to invoke Defense Production Act to expand production of vital hospital equipment. What's the impact of that? Also, the stock market keeps going down. Are we going to see another 2008? I will discuss these questions and much more with Jack Maxey, co-host of War Room Pandemic with Steve Bannon. In my opinion, one of the most diligent observers of the coronavirus pandemic in the country. How are you, Jack?
Doing very well, Simone. Thank you for having me.
Okay, why don't you give us an update of the current coronavirus situation? We're going to talk about President Trump's Defense Production Act, but other than that, what is the big news today?
Well, I think the big news is that we're seeing rapid increase in cases in New York and New York State. These are obviously focusing the whole country's attention on the reality that seems to be upon us. We've been speaking about the math for well over a month, but I think the math is catching up to everybody, and I think that there is nobody who does not doubt that a wave is on its way.
Okay, let's talk about the Defense Production Act that President Trump is ready to invoke. Here's a little background of that act. So the Defense Production Act is a 1950 wartime law in response to the start of the Korean War. It has three major components. The first authorized the president to require businesses to sign contracts or fulfill orders deemed necessary for national defense. The second authorized the president to establish mechanisms such as regulations, orders, and agencies to allocate materials, services, and facilities to promote national defense. The third section authorized the president to control the civilian economy so that scarce or critical materials necessary to the national defense efforts are available for defense needs. On Wednesday, Defense Secretary Mark Esper said that the Defense Department will make available up to 5 million N95 masks and other personal protective gears from U.S. strategic reserves. So Jack, first of all, how big of an impact will this have?
Well, I think we have to remember that the president invoked this once before last summer in terms of magnets that were necessary for military applications made with rare earth minerals. And we were concerned at that time about the supply chain originating in China, essentially impacting our military's ability to operate. So he's done it this time, and I think it's the correct thing to do. And I don't think it's as overly dramatic as some want to make it sound. Really what it does is it makes the government have first rights to the production of U.S. manufacturing. So if you have a mask manufacturer, the government can go to you and say, look, produce as many as you can, X, Y, Z, you deliver to us first. Sort of in a similar way to what the Chinese government did when they went in and they took down the production of 3M for, say, N95 masks. It's essentially to focus the nation's industrial capacity upon those things necessary for us to defeat this unseen enemy that President Trump is now calling it, the virus.
All right, so will this actually authorize the U.S. government to order the production of the pharmaceutical products back to the U.S. from China?
Well, it was interesting. You had a senator from Missouri earlier today said to any American company that is seeking financial aid from the United States Congress, you better come prepared with a roadmap to how you are bringing back production from overseas to the United States. We are not going to support companies that have been part of the problem. And if you want our support in the future, you essentially have to be part of the solution. So yes, I think this is a vital interest to everybody that we bring production back here. But what this is doing in the immediate near term is focusing those industries that can have an impact to focus all their efforts on what we're trying to do. And a perfect example is a great guy who's been on our show many times. And in fact, I think history will show that he sort of gave the clarion call concerning our lack of supplies. A gentleman named Mike Bowen, who works for a company called America Prestige down in Prestige Ameritech, forgive me, and they run a mask line down in Dallas. Now, 25 years ago, these guys in that single plant produced over 80% of all of the N95 masks for America. As of a month ago, they were producing about 1 million masks a day. I think they've doubled, tripled production to try and meet the needs of that we have now. But in his case, it would mean that the federal government could go to him and say, look, we preempt all your other orders. You need to give all the masks to us so that we can distribute them as needed. And this is just a rational way to sort of focus the supplies to the places where they're most needed. You spoke about the national strategic supply and the Pentagon's decision to give several million masks, N95 masks, and also some ventilators to the civilian hospitals. I think this is a good idea. I would say it's not part of the plan, but we are in a position where plans need to be modified as necessary, and I'm glad to see the president and his team taking every and all necessary steps to make that happen.
Right. I remember Mike Bowen said in the War Room episode that one concern he had was during the time of a crisis, everybody went to him and said, produce masks for us. So he ramped up his production. Once the crisis is over, everybody went to China again. So he ended up with this overcapacity of production. So do you think this time would be different? People would not move back to China?
I think everything is going to be different this time. Also, one of the things that really chapped Mike's biscuit and I think made me a little upset too was, and we still don't know who this person is apparently. This tells you the tyranny of these bureaucracies. When the president came into office, he made it clear that anything going into the Defense Department that had anything associated with an individual's kit, so a soldier's rifle, his boots, his shirt, his cap, his belt, his knife, whatever it is, all had to be produced inside America. Well, this was thought to be an amazing thing for a guy like Mike Bowen, right? We produce protective clothing for our military hospital personnel, so it should fall under that thing. Someone, somewhere, changed the criteria and declared these protective clothing to be medical devices rather than protective clothing. And so even during this administration, the VA and the Defense Department continued to buy from big name American companies like 3M from their production plants inside China. So in future, I think it's going to be very clear that all these things are going to have to be produced at home, or they're going to have to be produced in cooperation with our first tier allies who can be trusted and stockpiled accordingly. I don't think that anytime in the next 20 years we're going to be caught flat-footed like we were this time. So complacency is a huge danger. We haven't seen a virus like this since 1918, and 2009 H1N1 out of Mexico should have been a wake-up call. 2003 out of China should have been a wake-up call. But again, those turned out to be not nearly as dramatic and as impactful as this one. And like people do, they went back to their old habits once the storm had passed.
Right. Hopefully this time will be different. So let's talk about the economy. U.S. equities market plunged again at Wednesday's opening after a one-day bounce on Tuesday. So this morning, as soon as the market opened, the Dow dropped 1,000 points, or more than 5%. S&P 500 sank more than 130 points, a more than 5% decline. And the Nasdaq gave up more than 330 points, and more than 4% drop. So the Fed intervention, lowering the interest and injecting liquidity, hasn't seemed to be working. Why is that?
Well, I think you have to realize that the entire world is, in a sense, shut down. We now have 270 million Europeans who are in a state of kind of modified lockdown. So I remember a month and a half ago talking about that in China and thinking, oh my gosh, this is just off the charts. And now Europe is in the same condition. So this is not a situation where I think more liquidity is going to solve the problem. I believe personally that the only way we get this economy back on its feet is to defeat the virus and be able to put people back to work. Now, I think that what you saw with the bounce yesterday in the markets and the several sort of dead cat bounces that we've seen over the last week and a half, I think that what you're seeing right now is that reality is beginning to triumph over optimism, whereas prior to this, it was the triumph of optimism over reality. And the math is starting to sink in. For example, you look at a very large company like Boeing Aircraft. Boeing Aircraft is on its knees right now. Boeing represents, just Boeing, our second largest export for the entire country is Boeing Aircraft, after food and agriculture and products surrounding that. It's even larger than the oil industry in terms of its export value. So this is going to have impacts all across the economy, and I do not think that you are really doing much by throwing more money at it. I think that there can be made promises. I think that we can perhaps purchase some of the commercial paper. But at the end of the day, the only people, I think, if we're going to go to a massive stimulus, who should really be receiving things up front, and the most efficient way, I believe, to do that would be just to send money to the average American family. I'm not going to rely on a Fortune 500 company getting a big bonus and then trickling it down to their employees. To me, I think in this situation, that's not fair.
Right. So you think the central bank, instead of injecting liquidity to the market, should just give money to the American people?
Well, I think they should do both, but I'm going back to the original question, is it helping? I think that any rational observer would look at this and say, we've thrown almost $3 trillion at this problem, and the market is today where it was when the president took office. And this is not in any way a criticism of him. This is something that people have to understand. We keep calling this a wartime presidency, or the equivalent of going to war against this unseen enemy, the Wuhan virus. And the reality is, in a war, the only objective is victory. Not everybody comes out of a war unscathed, and I think that we have to just be open to the idea that we're all going to suffer through this together. I think one of the obscene things every time we have one of these hiccups, the people crying the most are the people on Wall Street and the bankers. Yet they're the architects of this house that is now falling apart before our eyes, and they're also the first ones begging to have us come put out their fire. Listen, I have less empathy for those guys who should have learned. They've had several lessons in just the last 20 years concerning their behavior. I have less empathy for them than some guy who's nailing in roof tiles out in Ohio. So if we are going to play this government come to the rescue, I want the government to come to the rescue of the American people. This is Jack Maxey speaking. I'm not speaking for anyone else.
Okay, I understand that. So, but on the other hand, if the government doesn't help the big companies, do you think we're going to see another 2008?
I think we've already seen another 2008. I said it yesterday. I think we are in full-on global recession, and the people who pretend to be mathematicians all day long while they gamble with their bank's money or their own money or their clients' money seem to be quite vacant in their ability to understand the math of this virus. We are watching it increase exponentially around the world. It is not going to get better. It is going to get worse. And the sooner people acknowledge that, the better off they will be. I can't say this more seriously. Everybody is going to be harmed in some way. And I think that the leaders out there, both politically and economically, who start giving people the hard truth are going to be the ones who come out of this with better reputations. Part of the problem, let's be very serious about this, everybody from the mavens of Wall Street to many of the Western leaders to even the leaders of China have tried to make this seem as if, the economy's going to be rosy. It's not going to be rosy. And everybody needs to grasp that. Along with many other things are not going to be rosy. We are in uncharted territory right now, and the normal tricks that we have to try and make little painful episodes go away or little errors and communal errors in judgment on the part of our Wall Street establishment are not going to work this time, because this isn't a crisis of liquidity. This is a crisis of China is offline. That's 40% of the global goods in the world are now in some part either not being produced or being produced at levels that are severely reduced. The same thing that we're seeing in terms of shortages of PPEs and masks and everything else. 85% of children's toys are produced in China. It's just that no one dies when they can't get a new Barbie, and they do die when they can't get a ventilator. So we're seeing this reduction in economic activity all across the world, and I think it's sort of painful to watch everybody focus on the stock market for me when we realize that there is so much human tragedy that we are witnessing right now and will continue to witness for some months.
Right. I think this coronavirus is really a wake-up call to the Chinese Communist Party. And one more thing unusual about the stock market is that usually when the market plunges, the price of the precious metal goes up. This time that didn't happen. The price for gold and silver go down as well. Why is that?
Well, there's an old saw that they have on Wall Street that when things go bad, you don't sell what you want to sell, you sell what you can sell. And we're seeing this in the bond market, we're seeing this in the precious metals market. In a situation like this, you would think that gold would go through the roof, but gold has actually lost $200. It's down from $1,700, I think, a week ago to roughly around $1,500 today, last time I looked at it. That's a significant drop. And it goes in the face of what we would expect in an orderly kind of market disruption that had a traditional trajectory. And I think right now what you're seeing is that everybody is scrambling for whatever cash they can get their hands on. Even though the world has, almost nil interest rates, what that has done is it's created massive amounts of malinvestments, massive amounts of leverage, right? If money's free, why don't I just double down on my stock market investments? Makes sense, right? It's been going up 15% every year, blah, blah, blah. And so everybody from the hedge fund geniuses to mom and pops have been equal geniuses over the last 3 years because there has been no downside. If money is free, there's no penalty for gambling, right? So I think everybody has to readjust. If you think about it, we've had 3,000 years of save money, save gold, put it under your fire pit, under a brick in your fireplace, whatever. And now for the first time in history, we see that even that's not good advice because we're in that much of a chaotic position right now. And the chaos is caused by the virus, and it's caused by our inability as human beings to absorb the information that is before us, the mathematics that are before us that show us the exponential growth of this virus. And yet we want to live in denial because we wish for a different outcome. I think that everybody has to be prepared to ride the wave. There's no other choice. You know, the priority for all the nations of the earth, it seems to me, should be to save lives and end the virus, and the rest of it will fall back into place. And if we've got good enough institutions, we've got a strong enough constitution, it will fall back into place. I think that we tend to take the things that are occurring to us right now and make them bigger than they are in the history of the world. In the history of the world, this will be a chapter. It will not be the last chapter, and we have to remember that.
Well said, Jack. Thank you. That's it for today's coronavirus special. You are watching Zooming In with Simone Gao. Please also download our podcast and be sure to come back tomorrow.